Good morning. Welcome to ENDO 2024 News Conference on Endocrine-disrupting chemicals. We're happy you're all here. My name is Mark Newman. I'm the executive editor of Endocrine News, published by the Endocrine Society. And with so many endocrine colleagues converging here in Boston, we wanted to take this opportunity to delve into the latest on endocrine-disrupting chemicals. With policymakers looking at ways to limit the public health risk of EDC exposure, the science needs to be a part of the conversation in a big way. And we are pleased to have with us several society members who work in this area. Dr. Marina Fernandez and Dr. Leonardo Trasande, who have represented the society at the United Nations Environment Program Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to end plastic pollution, and Dr. Scott Belcher, a researcher studying PFAS, or forever chemicals. Over the next 30 minutes or so, we will hear from our speakers. We will have a Q&A session on the UN Plastics Treaty process and a separate one on PFAS. Please note that this news conference is being broadcast live via webcast and that there are many journalists online with us right now. Because we are live streaming, it's important for all remarks to be made into a microphone to enable those who are joining us virtually to be able to hear what is being said in the room. Journalists who are attending online will be able to type their questions into the chat at any point during the news conference, and they will be addressed during the Q&A. First, I'd like to invite Dr. Trasande to speak.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person in Boston. As it turns out, I'm a little bit under the weather today, so it would not have worked out either way, but I'm glad to be with you all virtually. I'll go ahead and bring up my slides and take it from there. Great. So I'm just going to provide the top line summary of the presentation before going into the details. Many plastic additives that that we're talking about here in the context of the Global Plastics Treaty are known to interfere with hormone functioning and therefore are endocrine disrupting chemicals. We now have a large, clear, and extensive body of evidence confirming that there are human health effects of these chemicals, and the health and economic impacts at a societal scale are large for the economy. And we therefore need a plastics treaty, as my colleague Dr. Fernandez will emphasize, that reduces plastic pollution, recognizes hazards posed particularly by recycling and use of bioplastics, uses hazard rather than risk to evaluate chemicals used in plastic materials, expands biomonitoring globally, and ultimately establishes an independent scientific body to evaluate hazards of endocrine disrupting chemicals, and particularly chemicals used in plastics. Just to emphasize the scope of chemicals used in plastics materials, I'm going to emphasize my inability to cover the entire 16,000 chemicals used in plastic materials. We simply don't have the scientific body of evidence to comprehensively examine all of them to date. That said, what little we know, particularly about the 5 categories of chemicals listed on this slide, suggests substantial and profound effects for human health that run the entire lifespan from cradle to grave. We're talking about bisphenols used in polycarbonate plastics and aluminum can linings, phthalates, particularly used in food packaging, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances that I know Scott will go through in greater detail than I'll have the time to do, and brominated flame retardants, as well as organophosphorus esters. They're emerging replacements that are used to reduce flammability. And ultimately, one point that needs to be made when we think about the end cycle of plastics is that burning plastics contributes to dioxins in the environment, and dioxins are highly carcinogenic, even at the very lowest levels of exposure. So just to emphasize what little we know about these chemicals, in particular bisphenol, suggests a broad scope of health issues. We know that bisphenol A, for example, disrupts multiple metabolic mechanisms and is a prototype obesogen, making fat cells bigger, disrupting the function of a protein protecting the heart called adiponectin, and as a low-grade synthetic estrogen can have sex-specific effects on body mass. Now, a theme throughout this presentation is that we focused most of our research early on bisphenol A, one of 40 and maybe even more like 140 bisphenols that are now in manufacturing. What little we know about some of these so-called BPA-free replacements is that bisphenol S, for example, is as estrogenic, as toxic to embryos, and as persistent in the environment. Unfortunately, a theme of this presentation is that regulating one chemical at a time will not work. That simply creates a mindset of whack-a-mole and produces regrettable substitutes that have the same consequences, starting us back from ground zero. Phthalates are used in a variety of capacities. We divide them typically into low and high molecular weight phthalates. The ones used in shampoos, cosmetics, and lotions have anti-androgenic properties, and whereas the high molecular weight phthalates characteristically increase, well, they have multiple effects, but the most profound effect from a metabolic perspective is their increase in expression of receptors that are crucial in lipid and carbohydrate metabolism, called PPARs. We also know that phthalates can contribute to inflammation of the placenta and can disrupt sex hormone functions in the placenta, thereby contributing to preterm birth. These data are from a very recent large-scale study funded by the National Institutes of Health in the Environmental Influences on Child Health Outcomes program. And here we document in particular, again, this chemical whack-a-mole issue becoming a serious problem. Multiple studies had already identified di-2-ethylhexyl phthalate, or DEHP, to be associated with preterm birth. In this newer base of data, we were able to identify not only the effects of DEHP on preterm birth, with a 45% increase in the odds of preterm birth, but even higher, twofold in some cases or more, associations of di-N-octyl phthalate, di-isodecyl phthalate, and di-isononyl phthalate with preterm birth. And when you extrapolate the effects identified in this largely representative sample of the United States, that means 5 to 10% of US preterm births are linked to phthalate exposure, with costs in the order of $4 billion a year in lost economic productivity and direct medical care costs. We also know that phthalates contribute to cardiovascular mortality, whether through disruption of androgen function, because low T is a marker of or predictor of cardiovascular mortality, and potentially directly, and in both sexes, through inflammation in the coronary arteries themselves. Some of you may be familiar with a very recent paper that corroborates the findings described here, identifying that microplastics identified in carotid arteries were associated with a 4-fold increase in heart attack, stroke, or death. And consistent with these findings, we identified, using a large national database, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, increases in mortality due to cardiovascular disease, suggesting in the range of 50,000 attributable deaths per year and $23 billion in social costs. Bisphenols have also been associated with cardiovascular mortality. In addition, they've been associated with reduction in carotid in changes in intimal medial thickness, increases in severity of coronary artery disease, and reduced heart rate variability in adults. All of those are markers of progression of coronary artery disease. And the data on the right suggests increases in type 2 diabetes, both for bisphenol A and its replacement of bisphenol S, again reinforcing this reality of regrettable substitutes. Scott will talk in greater detail about the PFAS. What little we know suggests effects particularly on decreases in birth weight, and with consequences that are in the range potentially of contributing to 400,000 cases, of low birth weight during the past 2 decades globally, predominantly from Asian regions. So the global impact has not just been identified in US populations, it's been identified globally. We know that PFAS also contribute to adult weight gain and diabetes in multiple independently corroborated investigations. And in one study in which adults had lost diets from healthy diet and physical activity, the reduction induced by PFAS of the resting metabolic rate was associated with gaining that weight back. So nothing I'm talking about here de-emphasizes the role of diet and physical activity in preventing childhood obesity. We also know that brominated flame retardants have been consistently associated with decreases in cognitive function, with effects on thyroid hormone being the main mechanism, with thyroid hormone disruption in utero being associated not just with global IQ deficits, such as has been described in the epidemiologic studies, but increases in clinical conditions such as autism spectrum disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And I'm not going to be able to give the literature on infertility its true justice today. It's fair to say that the most compelling evidence for effects of chemicals used in plastics on fertility is in utero exposure to phthalates being consistently associated with reduced anogenital distance, which is a marker of sex hormone function in utero. Shortened AGD perseveres across a population such that the shorter AGD you have as a child is eventually the shorter AGD you have as an adult. And what we know about adult AGD is that it's consistently associated not just with reduced semen quality and testosterone level, but as well as coronary artery disease. So just to close my part of the presentation, I'll pass it off to Marina. We have put together a series of expert panels led by the Endocrine Society over the years documenting the health costs of EDCs. And just based on fewer than 5% of EDCs, a subset of diseases due to the few chemicals we studied, and a subset of costs due to the conditions examined, we identified first in Europe costs on the order of 160 billion euros a year, 1.2% of the gross domestic product. And that was just based on very rigorous and limiting criteria that took the state-of-the-art epidemiology and toxicology and attached probabilities of causation to reduce those costs further based upon the degrees of uncertainty. In the US, we repeated these cost estimates and found costs that were even higher, $340 billion. And that's because the US had required, due to a California law from 1975 to about 2013, the use of brominated flame retardants in polyurethane foams and a variety of consumer products, especially furniture. And as a result, we've had a tenfold higher level historically in the United States in serum of PVDEs compared to the United States. Now, as an aside, the reason why this slide is important about policy impacts is that they contribute to exposure, which ultimately downstream contributes to disease and additional social costs. The cost of flame retardants in Europe is only $9 billion because of regulation that was more proactively put into place. The good news is, from a United States perspective, it doesn't have to do with plastics, but it speaks to this policy impact. The US Food Quality Protection Act likely contributed to a lower US healthcare cost of pesticides, $42 billion, compared to $121 billion per annum in Europe, where regulations on organophosphate pesticides were more delayed. Now, we also know that PFAS costs in terms of health impacts as well. The previous analyses I mentioned didn't reflect that. So you have to add on something on the order of $5 to $63 billion in US healthcare costs driven by a variety of conditions, 13 listed here due to PFAS exposure. Now, what percentage of those costs are due to plastic? Well, the reality here is a lot of it. We did a recent study published in the Journal of the Endocrine Society documenting that anywhere from 16 to 100%, depending upon the chemical, of disease burden was due ultimately to chemicals used in their use in plastic materials. And that means that the disease costs that I described earlier, 249 billion of them are directly attributable in the US to plastic, largely driven by brominated flame retardants, but also due to phthalates, substantially in PFAS exposure. So the bottom line is that there's a substantial health, human, and business case for preventing the use of chemicals in plastic in particular, and ultimately reducing plastic production. And with that, I'm going to turn off my screen share and pass the baton to Dr. Fernandez, who will take the presentation from there. Thank you.
Setting the scene perfectly for this second part of this presentation. And I hope he convinced everyone that we need the Global Plastics Treaty that regulates chemicals. And I'm going to summarize a little bit of what he said. Wait a second, it's not passing. There we go. So my name is Marina Fernandez. I'm researcher at CONICET in Argentina. I'm also a member of the delegation of the Endocrine Society to the INC. And I'm also a member of the steering committee of the Science Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty. And as Leo said very perfectly, so plastics are basically composed by chemicals. And when we talk about plastic chemicals, we talk about monomers that are composing the plastics, additives that are giving these plastics several functions, processing aids that are used to make the plastics themselves. These are all chemicals that are known to be in plastics. Monomers can be polymerized to form polymers, and all these things form the plastics themselves. We also have another sort of chemicals that are non-intentionally added substances that can be incorporated to plastics during plastic production, plastic use, plastic and plastic production and use, sorry. So as Leo said, many plastic chemicals interfere with hormone functioning and are EDCs. So EDCs, or endocrine-disrupting chemicals, interfere with hormonal signaling systems. These are synthetic chemicals that can disrupt functions, contribute to disease. And in the second scientific statement of the Endocrine Society on endocrine-disrupting chemicals, we have this definition: EDCs are exogenous chemicals or mixture of chemicals that interfere with any aspect of hormone action. They can mimic, block, or modulate the system release, transport, or elimination of hormones, and they can affect many endocrine systems like brain, pituitary, gonads, thyroid, and other components of the endocrine systems. Here are only listed a few. Wait a second, it's not. There we go. So this story goes to 2022, actually before that, but in 2022, a historic process began. It was mandated by the United Nations Environment Assembly that there was going to be formed an intergovernmental negotiating committee, or INC, to develop an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, with the ambition to end the work by the end of 2024, that is this year. So what is the INC? It's a member state-led process. Members of the United Nations participate of this process, and this process will end with the signing of the Treaty on Plastic Pollution. The idea is that the process will end this year, and next year, in 2025, we will have a treaty that will be signed, and then another process will start, that is to implement this treaty. This process, or this INC, is governed by a bureau composed by members of the different UN regions. One of them acts as chair. Right now, our chair of the committee is Luis Vallas Valdivieso. He is the ambassador of Ecuador in the United Kingdom, and he stepped on to this role after the last session of the INC. And this process is open to participation from observer organizations, for instance, intergovernmental organizations, civil society organizations that involved also scientist organization, and also industry is involved in this process as observer organizations. But to make it clear, this process is led by governments, by member states, by the member states that form the United Nations. So, as I said, this process started in March 2022, where the mandate was given to form the negotiating committee. There was a first meeting that was set to start the rules of procedure and the schedule for this process. And there have been already 4 meetings, INC1 that took place in November 2022 and started to delve into some elements for the treaty and intersessional work between the INC1 and INC2. INC2 in Paris had some technical discussions on options for the treaty and a mandate for a 0 draft. This is a very preliminary draft with different options that then will turn into obligations and means of implementation. And then we had another 3rd meeting last year in Nairobi that resulted in a revised 0 draft that went live after November by the end of the year 2023. We also had a fourth meeting in Ottawa in April this year that finally had some agreement on having intersessional work on problematic plastic products, and also chemicals of concern and means of implementation regarding financial mechanisms for the implementation of the treaty. So we are now in the intersessional period after INC 4 and before INC 5, and we are waiting for some information on what the next steps will be. The idea is that we will have some intersessional work on criteria for chemicals and problematic plastic products. And there will be some people mandated to do this work. We still don't have clarity on how this is going to happen. But the idea is that we need to work fast, because in November this year, we will have the last session of the INC. So we need to have a treaty soon if we want to finish the work by next year, as it's mandated in the resolution 514, sorry. So how are we involved in the process? The Endocrine Society is sought for accreditation at the United Nations Environment Program to be involved in the negotiations of the treaty. And the things we've been doing is we've been connecting with different member states. We've been connecting with different intergovernmental organizations, and we've been giving our view on the importance of keeping health and chemicals involved in the treaty. So I'm going to say some of the key messages that we've been sharing in the INC. We believe that the Plastics Treaty is an opportunity to protect human and environmental health from the adverse effects of plastic pollution by minimizing exposures to EDC. We propose that we need a strong legally binding instrument that protects human and environmental health by limiting plastic production, because when we limit plastic production, we also limit the use of chemicals for its production and reducing exposure to harmful chemicals in plastic. We also need restrictions and prohibitions on hazardous chemicals, including EDCs. We need engagement of the academic research community in the identification of hazardous chemicals of concern and in monitoring and evaluation of the treaty, including through biomonitoring capacity. As Leo already mentioned before, we need to monitor the evaluation, the progress of the treaty, to measure reductions in exposure, and also to establish an independent advisory body to provide scientific information that includes academic scientists free of conflict of interest. Because as we saw before, industry is also participating in this process, and as well as many other interested parties. And we believe that we need academic scientists free of conflict of interest to be advising the process, who are actively publishing and engaged in endocrine research to measure on measures to minimize exposures to EDCs. So this is my part, and I'm here to answer any questions that you might have.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Fernandez. A few follow-up questions. Could either one of you talk to how the Endocrine Society has elevated the role of both science and scientists?
I can't hear.
The podium mic? Okay, sorry about that. I was just wanting you to address how the Endocrine Society has elevated the role of both science and scientists in this process. Can you hear me?
Mark, I can't hear you. You're muted on your line.
You're muted.
We are looking into that right now. Does it say I'm muted, Derek?
Not yet. There you go. You're unmuted.
Oh, there we go. Now can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Just wanted to ask you, how has the Endocrine Society in this process elevated both the role of science and scientists doing the work?
Thank you for the question. We've, as Marina said, have worked very closely with the governmental delegations who tried to communicate the need for the latest endocrine science to be the platform on which decision-making is made in the treaty. You could imagine there are substantial financial stakes involved. Plastics are in many ways off-ramps for fossil fuel production and consumption. The feedstocks of plastic are fossil fuels. And so there are countries and companies with proverbial skin in the game that will not want to have the health protective approach that we've outlined in our presentations. So our job in partnership with organizations like the Scientist Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty, the Food Packaging Forum, a host of organizations that really are trying to put health front and center. We've seen a remarkable amount of progress. I have to say that the Dakar meeting, the open-ended working group before INC1, which I attended, did not barely mention health. Now health is front and center in the treaty. There's really a very low likelihood that health will be absent from the treaty, even though some have argued very vigorously that plastic pollution is about the ocean. That is a transformative event, which I think will bear good for the planet and for the future. I think the devil will be in the details of how much plastic production is reduced by this treaty and how much will be voluntary as opposed to obligatory.
Right. Thank you.
I wanted to add just one thing.
Sure.
And I wanted to add just one thing to what Leo said. Our role here is also to remind the different member states about the importance of health, and to have health as important, not only to protect health as an important obligation, but also to monitoring the protection of health as a measure for monitoring the progress of the treaty. And that is the things we have been doing during the different INCs to remind states that this is important and that we have to have human and environmental health as a central, protection of human and environmental health as a central objective of the treaty. And we've been reiterating this in every opportunity possible that we have. Sorry for...
Right. So what are the next steps, though, in the negotiating committee process? And how will the Endocrine Society be involved with that?
We are in a period of intersessional, between this meeting and next meeting, we have some intersessional period, and there's going to be work on criteria for chemicals and products of concern, and also on means of implementation. Our role would be to help establish those criteria during this period. That's what we aim for, and also to keep the idea of chemicals being center and protection of health being center of the treaty obligations. Those are the ideas during this, between this intersessional period and the next meeting, and to have the protection of human and environmental health at the center of the treaty. Those would be and the Endocrine Society is the leader on this aspect. So those are my ideas.
If I can just add very briefly, the zero draft in Ottawa was elaborated into a rather ghastly and long document with brackets and options. And we'd like to see health not bracketed in the treaty. That's really crucial. And there are items in this intersessional work that Marina described that are going to be actively debated, and the experts that are convened as part of that open-ended working group, we urge and hope are representative of the health issues at stake in this treaty, because behind the scenes, there will be ongoing trade-offs and negotiations behind by the member states. And ultimately, the goal is to try to have a consensus document elaborated by the end of the in-person meeting in Busan in November and early December.
And I think, why don't we go ahead and open it up for questions from the journalists in-house and on the line.
Great, thank you, Mark. Any questions from anyone in the room? Great, I think we can move on to talking about PFAS.
Okay, then now I'd like to let Dr. Belcher take the stand. Well, take the podium, not the stand. It's not a trial.
Let's see if I can follow directions here. All right. Thank you. I want to first start by thanking the Endocrine Society. It's quite an honor to be here at ENDO 2024 to talk about my group's approaches over the last 5 or 6 years on integrating communities and the environment into the scientific study of PFAS. But I really want to highlight some of the things that Marina and Leo touched on about the role of the Endocrine Society in this. Over the last 2 decades, the Endocrine Society has been the leading champion of endocrine science, endocrine disruptor science, and has really put on the forefront the need to have consolidated and consistent research on the topic of endocrine disruptors. And through this, we've made great strides that are coming to fruition. The influences that we're beginning to have at the United Nations, the OECD, and really on the global front has been really important in improving public health and an awareness of endocrine disruptors as a whole. What I want to do today is shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the symposium that we're having this afternoon. It is entitled Endocrine-Disrupting Chemicals in Reproductive Endocrinology. My talk, more than a specific impact, will be coming at 5 o'clock, but a specific impact on reproduction actually involves a new approach that is, well, a relatively new approach that's holistic and integrated across scientific disciplines that really focuses down to the translational component of getting to the communities and individuals that are most impacted by chemical pollution. As we've talked about with great introductions on the importance, both financially as well as in human health, of chemical contaminants that Leo gave, PFAS is the main focus of the research that we'll be focusing on. As touched on by Leo very briefly, these chemicals are a class of chemicals that have been around since the Manhattan Project in the 1940s that are becoming more and more apparent to be actually one of the most impactful and harmful chemical pollutants of this century, and arguably definitely the second half of the last century. These compounds are essentially everywhere and in everything. They're man-made pollutants. They have many, many uses because of their chemical structures and the properties that they have. They are chemically stable and resistant to degradation, which is a good thing for industrial applications, but a very bad thing when these chemicals are released out to the environment and are there essentially until the end of time in some form or another. They are toxic in many, many organs. They are endocrine disruptors, but they are also toxicants that transcend specific classes of toxicity. We really think them as system-wide toxicants because of their different chemical behavior. And part of that, very different from the classes of organic compounds that we think of as persistent, the persistent organic pollutants, or POPs, that accumulate in fat-rich body compartments. PFAS, because of their chemical properties, bind to proteins and thus are able to transcend all different body compartments and become, once they accumulate, toxic within those compartments. So to sum that up, PFAS can be thought of, or are, toxic, they are persistent, they are bioaccumulative, and they're also mobile in the environment. And that means once into the environment, whether it's into soil or water, their chemical properties allow them to be distributed either into groundwater, into the air, into surface vapor on ocean foam, and essentially global contaminants throughout the world. What I do want to focus on, and I'm going to focus in on my talk today, is a problem with one PFAS that had a name that was actually quite useful for people to remember, Genex. It was discovered in the drinking water of North Carolina somewhere around 2016. This is a map from the Environmental Working Group, zeroing in on North Carolina. These dots on here are drinking water sources that have been analyzed for PFAS, and the light blue ones are all of those above recommended levels for contaminants in the drinking water. This next map comes from the Cape Fear Public Utility, and it very nicely shows, in a way that you don't have to look too closely, you'll see the Cape Fear River outlined here with these pie charts showing wastewater treatment facilities where samples were taken downstream of each of those. Upstream, you'll see this kind of blue-gray box and this red box. These are two of the so-called legacy PFAS that were detected. Shown here is the production facility owned by Chemours Company, previously by DuPont. And then you'll start to see, rather than these blue and red, you'll see this appearance of these gray and yellow slices into this pie. You can't see it. Did I touch something I shouldn't have? Good. Usually that happens when it goes blank. It's my fault. I own that. But you'll see that these gray and yellow slices come into this and take over the majority of this. There's actually, you'll take my word for it because I know you can't see it, but there's a doubling of the PFAS in that concentration in the surface water downstream of the production facility, and that gray and yellow slice represents those production components specific to this corporation. So it really ties in this contamination to that production facility, and that's one of the main sources of PFAS contamination in North Carolina. I'm going to try to not hit this too many times to get it to go. There we go. So what is the source of this problem? This is actually production of fluoropolymers. One of them is a very important fluoropolymer. It's called Nafion. It is a fluoropolymer essentially of a Teflon backbone of PFAS with these extensions of these fluoral ether chemistry hanging off the end. Part of that, our problem is that with this, there's a number of production byproducts that are not regulated and able to be directly discharged into the Cape Fear River. This has resulted in this Genex contamination and this Nafion contamination of this one byproduct 2, which we can assay pretty relatively easy using high-resolution mass spectrometry. And this, Marina just said I'm muted, so, for the website. So, you don't want me to start again. All right. Thank you, Marina. So, yeah, and this is Cape Fear downstream where the drinking water comes from. This is Wilmington, North Carolina. And yes, I'm going to try one more thing here to get the computer to behave for me. I guess my slides broke this. So, okay, I've pushed 15 buttons. I think I've frozen it. So what I'm going to go ahead, so what I wanted to introduce was the concept of One Health. One Health essentially integrates impacts on the environment, animals, and human health together in a holistic approach. We have been working with communities. This is actually, my slide worked, fantastic. So this is kind of the framework that we've been using. We've been calling it a feed-forward approach, where all of these components that range from our laboratory studies to community engagement, community-based solutions, as well as using the ecosystem and sentinels within that ecosystem, animals, wildlife, to detect health effects that could be impactful for improving human health. What I was going to highlight in my further study here is 3 studies where we've looked at pets in the homes, fish in the rivers, and alligators that consume those fish. I wanted to, I don't know why we're so slow here, but does anybody else have control where you can just forward for me, or we'll take a timeout? Sorry, apologize. There you go.
Turn it on and off. Perfect.
So what I want to introduce, the importance of this is working with communities. These are our community members here who reached out, contacted, actually our state representatives in North Carolina, who actually worked across the aisle. Representative John Soka and Senator Kirk DeVeers, working for these communities, reached out to me to see if we could address some of the concerns with the community that they had, not only for themselves, but also for these pets. The problem that we focused on is shown very nicely here in this next graphic. This is zooming in on the production facility and monitoring of 1,800 different private wells with contamination. All of those shown in red have Gen-X contamination above a criteria that required intervention by the state and by Chemours to supply drinking water and ultimately water filtration for the individual wells. This was our study area shown in red. We used a model of working with community members to guide the science while we developed it into testable hypotheses and approaches, and working with a local veterinarian. We collected blood samples in 2020 from 31 dogs and 32 horses from owners who had documented Gen-X contamination in their wells that had information that we could use to assess that. We used a method of essentially using blood chemistry and veterinary approaches to look at their health, as well as the levels of contamination in each of these species. One thing that we did see, PFAS was present in 100% of the samples that we had, both horses and dogs. Dogs in the home and ones that were outside did have higher levels than the horses. These were largely driven by these legacy PFAS, but not the fluoral ethers in the well water. Napheon byproduct, this production intermediate, was present in the horses, leading us to conclude that much of that exposure, consistent with other research that we have done, was probably coming from food and other components in the outside environment, which was less evident within the homes, largely suggesting that dust and other components of that in-health environment were impacting these animals. And with that as our impact, showing that we could actually have good information on biomonitoring through these use of sentinel animals, I wanted to refer back to our upcoming session, where we actually can go into a little more time on the power of this One Health approach and suggesting ways that endocrine scientists can become more involved and more involved with these multi-integrated approaches.
Thank you, Dr. Belcher. One follow-up question. I know that the EPA has pretty stringent drinking water bans, and the EU is looking at it. Can you talk a bit to the different approaches?
Absolutely. So in the United States, much of our regulation is based on a concept of risk assessment, which integrates both chemical hazard assessment and exposure assessment into a model of where science has to prove the chemical guilty before it can be regulated. By contrast, Europe uses a somewhat different approach that essentially the chemicals are not considered innocent, as it were, until proven guilty, but rather if the burden of proof is suggestive that there will be harm, then regulation can occur. Now, the US EPA's recent guidelines on essentially that involve 6 different PFAS chemicals is a huge step forward. It's the first major regulation that we've had on these chemicals, especially in drinking water, based on the Clean Drinking Water Act, that will be incredibly impactful. However, it's important to note that PFAS is not a single chemical or 6 chemicals, but thousands of different chemicals. And as Leo mentioned earlier, using the chemical whack-a-mole approach of regulation, we've come to a point where we are far beyond using this naive approach that if we change a single component of a molecule, that it can't be regulated. It's time to think about regulating compounds like PFAS as classes, which Europe is considering in a much more robust way at this point, and hopefully the United States will make efforts to refine this approach. However, there are limitations of what's going on in Europe. There's these things, while trying to regulate, there's this thing called derogations, or what are the exceptions that we have to this. And this list can be driven to a rather massive list, where in fact, many chemicals will still be used, but supposedly banned in many cases. This comes into play especially prominent with even PFOA and PFAS, which have been banned, according to the Stockholm Convention, as persistent chemicals for many years. However, there are exceptions to that use, and we are still seeing very high amounts of PFAS, for example, in biota or life, in any of the organisms that we look at. It's the most highly concentrated and most common PFAS present in all animals.
But there seem to be thousands of different types of PFAS. What, on an individual level, what can the average person do to limit their exposure? Well,
we're strong believers in education. This is why we use the approaches that we do. We are informing people, even in highly impacted communities. What we're finding is somewhere, again, anecdotally, 15–20% of people that are living in contaminated areas, known contaminated areas, we feel it's in the press quite frequently. There's no knowledge within the community, whether it is bad news burnout, combination of effects, all of this. We've been working very hard by, one-on-one being out there with people, educating, doing those components or aspects of this work, bringing the science to the people and helping the people in the communities help us ask the best scientific questions and most impactful questions.
All right, so I guess now we're going to open up the floor to questions, if there's any in here or out there.
Hello, Mike Menasher from Helio at Endocrine today. The research you presented is really, really interesting. I guess I have 2 questions with that. One, are there ways to conduct similar types of studies in communities across the country, or are there limitations to what we have available as far as knowledge of chemicals in drinking water or in other areas? And then second, do you really think that this could have an impact on raising just awareness and making a push to better regulate, PFAS in the U.S.?
So first question, is it expandable? Absolutely. There are great groups doing great works with Native communities across the country. We've been working essentially focusing on some of the more blatant environmental justice issues, where getting to the most impacted communities are the least likely to be able to change behaviors through spending money, buying water filters, other things, etc. So trying to get up and bring those discussions and the research opportunities where we're trying to integrate ways of bringing cost-effective, say, filtration in this case, which isn't ideal, but filtration to people in those communities. So I think there's no limitation to this approach, and I think that's part of the power of it. And the second part was, I'm sorry, I started to, just briefly.
Just if these types of studies you think could better raise sort of awareness about regulation.
Absolutely, and parts that I didn't talk about of what we're doing, we're working very closely with educators, social science. Actually, the results of our science in the form that's in the scientific journal is now in 10th through 12th grade curriculum in the state of North Carolina in about, I think, 35 different high schools. And this is working with colleagues that have been funded through different efforts and using these as really good examples that people can relate to, whether it's, you know, the water you're drinking, fish you're eating, the alligators that are, you know, in your front yard sometimes.
Anybody else? All right, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you, Dr. Belcher, and our speakers online, and the journalists who took the time out to cover this important issue that affects us all the time, every day, everywhere we go. As a reminder, the recordings of these press conferences will be available on our website and YouTube channel. And if you have additional questions or would like to set up an interview with any of our speakers, just reach out to us at media@endocrine.org. Thank you.